Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. So today I wanted to talk about narcissism. And unfortunately, this is a growing phenomena in society. It used to be fairly rare, and it's becoming increasingly common. So what are the characteristics of narcissism? Because it's not necessarily an overt outward vanity. And every single person has some level of narcissistic behavior in their repertoire because, in a way, it is a survival mechanism. So what I'm really talking about when I talk about narcissism is actually a personality disorder. So let's go through some of the signs and symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. An exaggerated sense of self-importance, entitlement, which requires constant admiration. They expect to be recognized as superior with or without the achievements that warrant it. They exaggerate and even pathologically lie. They have fantasies and delusions about success, power, brilliance, intellect, beauty, etc. They have a superiority complex over everyone else. Every single conversation is in some way about them. They believe that the rules don't apply to them, which means that they are expectant of special favors and compliance. They are exploitative of other people. They have very little empathy for anyone except themselves. They're envious of others, and they also believe that others are envious of them. They can be incredibly pretentious and arrogant, and they insist on having the best of everything. They also don't manage their own emotions very well. They tend to become impatient or angry, but they can also become depressed, strangely enough. And occasionally, narcissism displays itself as vulnerability in a sort of a victim status. Okay, so those are the basic characteristics of a narcissistic personality. But narcissistic personalities come in a wide variety, and so not all of them present exactly the same way. Some people are more shy and vulnerable because they have not had their ego reinforced that much. So I wanted to talk about narcissism in relation to the personality of Satan. If you've seen my videos before, then you probably have heard me said that God is love and love is boundaries. God's love actually does require a certain standard of behavior. There's also quite defined parameters around what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Now, that doesn't mean that God is not forgiving and patient, because he is loving, but that does mean that he has standards. And he's also very clearly defined what these standards are. So he separates light from dark. Satan, on the other hand, and narcissists as well, they seek to blur the lines. This personality type is not tolerant of any boundaries. They don't like having any kind of standard imposed on them. They don't like having any kind of parameters imposed on them. They don't believe that rules apply to them. So they are constantly breaking boundaries with other people, and they can become criminal. How do they often get away with their behavior? Well, narcissistic people are known for utilizing a form of psychological abuse known as gaslighting. And this is where they attempt to warp the perceptions of everyone around them so that everyone else's sense of reality revolves around whatever the narcissist's sense of reality is, except that the narcissist constantly changes reality to suit themselves. Basically, they're trying to get away with evil deeds and they attempt to shirk any accountability that they have for committing those deeds, and they'll often do it at your expense. In order to do this, they have to persuade other people of their perception of right and wrong, which is that they're right and you're wrong. Or they'll also say that there is no right and there is no wrong. With narcissists, if you ever confront them with their behavior and try to hold them to account, if you point out how they have abused and exploited you, they say that that's your truth, not their truth. They reject their responsibility. And they will either outright deny facts or they will blame their victims, or both. So what gives them the idea that they can do this? Well, it kind of goes back to what made Satan think that he can behave this way. They have decided that they can author truth because they are God. Narcissists appoint themselves to godhood in your life. You are their created being because they live in this fantasy world. So everyone around them is just an actor who's there to service them and their story. So they create you in their own mind, and then when you don't follow the script, they become enraged. Their version of godhood is to be tyrannical and exploitative. And that's why they see absolutely no issue with trampling all over your boundaries. So when you say to them, I don't want to do this, or I can't do this, all they hear is, you are defying your God and I shall strike you down. In sharp contrast, the true and living God does have boundaries and does have standards. And he also gave us free will so that we can actually make a choice as to whether we have a relationship with him or not. Now, that doesn't mean that the wrong relationship with God doesn't have consequences, because it does. But the thing is, he has told us what the parameters are of the relationship, and then it's up to us whether we want to follow that or not. And we know what the consequences are ahead of time, so we can make an educated decision. However, Satan calls this kind of love overbearing because it doesn't permit evil. He insists that other people having boundaries and other people having free will is oppressive to the things that he wants, because he wants to trample your boundaries. And that's the cognitive dissonance of narcissism, because they are extremely permissive of evil and extremely intolerant of rules and boundaries. Everything that the narcissist wants, the narcissist gets, regardless of what it costs you. And because this rule system is incredibly self-centered, it's often very arbitrary and subject to change. The goalposts will be shifted at the whim of the abuser whenever they need to shift the rules so that it can suit them. God's rules, on the other hand, are consistent. They don't change, and we can always know what they are ahead of time. If we break any of God's laws, we have a means of forgiveness from him. He is merciful to those who are humble and repentant. One of the defining characteristics of narcissism is pride. Narcissism never says sorry, and instead it will be defiant and proud of its disobedience. And this is exactly what caused the fall of Lucifer. Puffed up with pride and hubris, Lucifer elevated himself to the position of God. And since the beginning of time, he's also encouraged human beings to do the exact same thing. So narcissism always attempts to elevate human beings to the status of a demigod. But this goes against the order of creation. It's impossible. It can't be done. We do not possess that kind of power, nor do we possess any of the eternal wisdom of God. We're fallible. God is not. And every time we attempt to seize control of a position that doesn't belong to us, we inevitably screw it up. Aside from kind of obvious reasons why we might screw it up, what is the reason why we screw it up? It pretty much boils down to this, that the scope of the responsibility of that kind of position is not something that we can handle. A good example of this would be to ask whether or not children can be responsible for their parents. Now, logically, people will say, well, they can't. And yet, there are so many families where the parents capitulate to the whims of the children, and the children turn into little tyrants. When you kind of give in to people who are in a very weak and vulnerable position, like children, then you're essentially giving them the responsibility as well as the power. So why do parents do this? Because they don't want to be responsible either. Positions of authority come with responsibility. That's what parenting is, and it makes you an unpopular person with your children. But if you want them to grow up well adjusted, then you have to be the bad guy. And so narcissism tends to flourish when you have situations where the people who are supposed to be in charge, who are naturally in that position, have shirked their responsibility. Narcissism at its core wants all of the power and none of the accountability. And we can see an example of this with Meghan Markle. Now, I just have to say, it's impossible to diagnose someone that you've never met, so celebrities can't really be diagnosed with mental disorders by people who are just watching from the outside. However, there are certain behaviors which will indicate if someone has a personality disorder, and so that's what I'm basing this assessment off. It might be true, it might not be true. So take this with a grain of salt, but at least consider it a working example. So from what I've seen of the royal family saga, it seems like an American actress went to a foreign country and attempted to overthrow their monarchy, which if you think about it, is pretty wild. She also seems to lie a lot, like almost compulsively or pathologically. Like she lies when it's completely unnecessary, when it doesn't really even serve a purpose. For example, during her Oprah interview, she talked about how her wedding had actually been before the wedding date, and she claimed that the Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury said, "No, I didn't. That's called a rehearsal. You've been married before." And there's a bunch of stuff in that interview which is provably false. One of the things that she has claimed in various different interviews is that she had never heard of Prince Harry before she dated him, which, unless she was living under a rock, is highly unlikely. And another claim that she made is that she didn't understand politics or diplomacy, except that she has a degree from Midwestern University in international relations, and she also did an internship at the US Embassy in Venezuela. So by that standard, she should understand more than most people how diplomacy and how international politics works. I would suggest that she understands, but she doesn't like it. It seems like she doesn't believe that the rules apply to her. That's narcissism. Breezing into the monarchy of a foreign country, making demands left, right, and centre, spending taxpayer money on a luxury wardrobe. Attempting to dictate to the Queen of England, throwing a hissy fit over antique, priceless jewellery that doesn't belong to her, and refusing to follow protocol when she was instructed to. She didn't just marry into the British royal family, they offered her a job as well, and she didn't have to take that job, but she did. Because she wanted the title, she wanted the prestige, and she wanted the power. Harry's wife only had a problem with the royal family after they told her no. And she only started having a problem with the British media after they began holding her accountable for her behaviour. However, she still wants the titles, and she wants her children to have titles, and she wants all the perks of being royal. But she doesn't want anyone to critique her behaviour, and she doesn't want anyone to tell her what to do. She used to have a blog called The Tig, and in that blog she wrote an article about Catherine and William's wedding. So apparently she had never heard of Harry, but she had heard of his brother and his brother's wife. And what she wrote in that piece is that she wanted to be a princess of power. All the power and none of the responsibility. So as soon as anyone says no to her, or as soon as anyone holds her accountable and critiques her behaviour, she plays the victim. And this fits in nicely with a recent study into Dark-Triad personalities. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy are all indications of a Dark-Triad personality. And Dark-Triad personalities like to play the victim. Queen Elizabeth gave her grandson's wife a position of enormous privilege. She granted her huge amounts of leeway and special treatment which no one else had ever received from the royal family in the past. But the all-consuming envy in narcissism wouldn't allow Meghan to appreciate it. She squandered her opportunity and she trampled all over the hospitality of her new in-laws. And again, we can see parallels between this and Satan. So Satan was also given a very lofty position, and the thing is, it went to his head. He received all of the surrounding glory of God, and he believed that he was entitled to it. But he didn't have what it took to actually be God, to have that kind of responsibility and to deal justly and fairly with people. And one final thing, the name Satan actually translates as the accuser. And this is a characteristic that we can see over and over again, whether it's interviews or lawsuits. So, does that mean that Harry's wife is destined for the lake of fire along with Satan? Well, that's impossible to say. Only God knows that. But I will say this. Sooner or later, she will have to reckon with someone who outranks her, and she will not be able to dethrone him. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.